Hello class, so this is my oral presentation as you know. Um, I have my outline in front of me. I will, just in case, but I will do my best to use it as little as possible because that's the assignment. My whole life, well, practically my whole life anyways, and I wanted to create characters and stories that would inspire people or at least entertain them. And recently, for the last few years and even before that, I've made a habit of, in my spare time, doing as such by creating characters and coming up with stories for them to live out. And even someone like me who does a lot of that in their spare time might sometimes need help for professionals, which is why I decided to do my research on the subject of writing fiction and more particularly on creating characters. So the book I have decided to use is Marc-Olivier Louvreau's manuel Le petit manuel du scénariste, tout pour l'essentiel pour écrire un scénario, particularly the section on on creating and writing characters, which would be pages 15 through 108. The first thing I would like to say is that even though personally, as I said before, I spent a lot of time on my own free time creating and developing stories and characters, this book, it contains a few things that even though I already did, I never really thought about actively, which would be interesting to from a beginner's point of view for people is the meta existence of the characters, which by that I mean, and the author means, that no matter how developed and complex you make a character, they never they never will exist through anything other than the things that they do in your stories. So if if something that a character doesn't contribute to the story or isn't mentioned in the story, then that thing doesn't exist. They don't exist beyond their role in the story. And another thing that I found interesting is the what they call the Hitchcockian method of creating characters after you know who, after Mr. Alfred Hitchcock, is to create a character, you take a pre-existing template of a character and you make them do the opposite of what you expect. For example, the example they give in the book would be a fireman that commits arson as opposed to putting out fires, which is the job of a fireman. Another thing that they bring up that I didn't really actively think about, but seems obvious in retrospect, is that every character wants approbation for their action. They need a motivation, because if your characters don't care, why should the audience or the reader care? And they won't. There's also a few things that are considered essentials when you're writing a story. Obviously, you need a character. You need characters. I don't think it would be possible to create a story with no active characters in them. You need a protagonist, because otherwise, the protagonist is the one that you follow through the story, not necessarily the hero. If if you don't follow anyone, then there is no story, and you need an antagonist, which is the character that goes against the protagonist. Because if you don't have conflict, then you have to work real a lot even harder to make your story interesting. Because if there's no conflict, then there's no end goal. There's no reason to follow your story. And it's perfectly fine to have a story with no major conflicts, but it might be boring for some people. I also have one major complaint is that even though it's good for beginners, for someone like me who is far from being a professional and who only does character and creation work in their spare time, a lot of the stuff seems fairly obvious and seems like things you could have learned just by experimenting or working on your own time. Like the types of characters, there's very few types of characters in the book that most people don't already know about, like the protagonist and the antagonist and the supporting cast and all of those. And there's also how it tells us to define your characters through their actions, through their dialogue, which is obviously it works, but it's we already know that. Like whenever you watch a movie, you already know that you learn the character's personality through the dialogue and through what they do, which is the most obvious way of doing it, but maybe the only. I don't think it's the only way, and would be interesting to see more original ways of defining and developing your characters. And finally, in conclusion, while I found the book to be pretty interesting, I don't think it was very useful to me as someone who already has a bit of experience in creating stories and characters, even if just in my spare time as a hobby. But if you really want to create stories but you have no idea why, then yeah, maybe it would be a good idea to check it out. But personally, I think a better way would be to research the specific subject you want to create stories around or about, rather than this general guide to character writing, which is what it is. So that way you'll have more of a clear idea about how to write. But again, if you're a beginner who doesn't really know anything about writing, then I think it would still be a good choice. Well, that's it. Goodbye.